congratulations. You want to be a UX designer. Welcome. What exactly are you getting yourself into? Well, that's what we at CanUX want to help a little bit with. And so thanks to our 2018 State of Canadian UX report. Last year, because we didn't really have enough to do while we were getting ready for CanUX 2018, Cornelius, my co-chair, decided, you know, we should totally do a report and a study on everything going on in UX in Canada. I was like, nice. That's insane. So what we realized, though, is that there wasn't a lot of data on Canadian UX industry, right? So everything that you look up, it tends to be about the US. And so this actually made a lot of sense. So yeah, I had to agree. He was very right. So it really is unknown territory. And what we wanted to do was figure out what does our industry actually look like without having to go to Indeed.com or any of the resources. We really wanted to get a sense of what's going on in Canada. So whether you're starting out or you're changing careers, this kind of information can be really valuable, right, in helping you plan your next step or negotiate your salary, or even just really, comparing yourself to your peers to find out, am I behind, right? How am I doing? Let's be honest, we all do it. And to our knowledge, we actually couldn't find any Canadian data about the UX industry. So there may have been stuff like this before, but we could not find it. So it made sense to conduct our own survey. And we wanted to know who's the Canadian UXer, where do they live, what do they do, where do they work, is there diversity in the industry across Canada, and is there parity among the various groups who are doing UX? So those are the types of questions that we explore. So we posted the survey last summer, and it ran until late October, right before CanUX. And we, as Audrey mentioned, we presented a little tiny snippet of our findings on stage, and then the full report went up in December. At the end of the presentation, there's a nice short URL that you can use to go review the whole study if you're interested. And we'll cover today the findings from that. Hopefully this is the first of many studies, so hopefully we'll be able to do this year over year, and I will give you a caveat. There were, we have responses and we have numbers and we're drawing conclusions, but really these are the conclusions based on the people who responded to our survey, right? So we don't know how representative this is. It's going to take us a few tries to go and do the survey a few times before we can actually start saying this is really what's going on in the industry. But at least it's somewhere to start from, and it gives us a baseline. So, who filled out the survey? We were really excited. For a first-year report, we were really excited with the numbers. We had almost 450 people who responded to the study, so that was really exciting, and they represented 11 of the 13 provinces and territories. We promoted the survey primarily through social media and through our networks, and so we were really excited that we were able to get from across the country. And most of the responses, 85%, were from Ontario and Quebec, and we had no responses from Nunavut or Newfoundland. So we managed to get responses from some pretty disparate locations, though, like the Yukon, which was really encouraging, so that was really nice. And we actually had participants from 41 different locations. The 3 top cities were Ottawa, Gatineau, Toronto, and Montreal. So like I said, this is primarily located in central Canada. Is that because CanUX is here? Is that just because those were the active people who happened to see us on social? Who knows? So this is hopefully going to evolve as we do more surveys. And our goal for next year is really to expand the respondent space so that we can reach more and more and more cities across Canada. One thing we were really excited about was the gender mix. So we were quite surprised that in our survey base, the women outnumbered the men. So we don't know if that's remotely indicative of what's going on in UX in Canada, or if those are just the people who like to fill out surveys. Again, first year, we don't know. But we were really happy. We did have a couple of non-binary folks who did respond as well, and we combined those numbers with the women. So when we talk about the gender differences, it's women and non-binary people are together, and then we've got the men on the other side. So, but it was just 0.44 of our responses that were from non-binary people, so we're going to be working on expanding that one as well. Now, we still need to do some work to increase the ethnic diversity of our respondents. So those who self-identified as white were 71% of our answers, right? So, and then those who self-identified as a visible minority were 20%, and then some abstained. So that's why the numbers don't always add up to 100. Again, we don't know how this compares to the actual diversity of the UX industry in Canada, but this is an area where we're going to be working on getting more folks so that we can have more balance and we can get better representation for the survey. But just to keep that in mind as we go through. Now, the connection between age and experience levels was actually really interesting for us. So when it comes to age, majority of our respondents fell in two age brackets, 26 to 35 and 36 to 45. So 70% of our responses were between 26 and 45 years old. However, when you go to experience, the median experience level was 5 years. So we got all these 26 to 46-year-olds, and then the median experience was 5 years. So that was really interesting. So full 50% were either above or below the 5-year mark. And that was really, really interesting when we look at the salary levels and when we look at some of the skill sets and that sort of thing. So keeping that in mind. So a full 50% have less than 5 years. 21% were between 5 and 10 years. 25% were 10 years or more. And I'm like at the 20 plus years, and we didn't even have a category for that. So thanks. So again, because 70% of our participants are between 26 and 45, and such a high percentage have fewer than 5 years experience, UX has been around for at least 20 years, or you can think of it as being more like 40 years if you consider the Catalyst to be the heyday of interaction design and Don Norman publishing the design of everyday things. So depending on how old you think UX is, if you go to Twitter, you might think it's basically nascent because no one can define it. But it was really interesting as we were trying to figure out, why is there such a low level of experience among our respondents? Is that because those are people who like to respond to surveys? Is it because this is a career change for some people because they come through another career and then they're moving into UX later on? Is it because of post-secondary education? So again, this is going to be something that we're really, really going to be interested in exploring. You're going to hear that a lot. First study, right? So there's a lot of stuff we're going to be really interested in exploring over the coming years. Now, speaking of education, our survey respondents are a very highly educated group. A large proportion had bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and college diplomas. So very highly educated bunch of people. And in terms of how they get their skills and keep their skills sharp, more than half keep up with the latest experience design knowledge through conferences, something we were very happy to hear about at CanUX. Thank you very much. Almost half learned through school courses, to which I say lucky you, because I certainly did not. A quarter have completed a UX certification, which blew my mind, because how long has UX certification been around, right? So just a few years ago, there weren't a lot of options to get certified in UX, and now there's certificate programs in post-secondary institutions, and there's accelerated certifications through consultancies, UX-related training offered by professional organizations like the Institute of Business Analysis. So among our recipients, it was rather interesting actually to see such a high number that are certified, although we don't really know what certified means. Among our respondents, nearly a third had no formal training in experience design. Now, we don't know if that means that they're fully untrained or if they just don't have formal training, so maybe they're self-taught, maybe they're taking online courses. And that particular category, the no formal training category, is the only one in which men outnumbered the women. So that was an interesting one as well. So overall, our respondent base consisted nearly equally of males and females between 26 and 45 years of age. They're educated and they're still getting trained. And their median experience level is 5 years. So now we're going to take a look at how UX fares in Canadian companies. So when you're heading out into the job market, what can you expect from the companies who are actually hiring UX professionals? We decided to explore what kind of Canadian organizations UXers work in, what kind of job titles they have, and how mature UX is across those organizations. So let's start with the titles. 40% of responders self-identify as UX designers, and I say, lucky them. I, as a UXer, have rarely ever had a title that was remotely related to UX. I've been a multimedia content developer, an internal and external communications specialist, graphical user interface designer, business analyst, senior consultant, e-coms manager, and I didn't get a UX designer title until a few years ago, and I had to ask for it. To say, please, please call me UX designer. So how does the rest of our response group fare? So after UX designer, the next most popular grouping has UX generalist. I have no idea what that is. I don't know what a UX generalist is. I've never seen a UX generalist. UX researcher, UX lead, and interaction designer. So that was sort of the first group. And then UX strategist, information architect, and visual designers. That was the next bunch. And the least popular grouping were all of the leadership positions, all of the executive titles. So UX manager, head of UX, VP of UX, and CXO, which I've never seen before, but I hear that it's a thing. One oversight this year is we didn't have product designer, and there were a bunch of people who wrote in that we really should have product designers, so we're going to add that in next year and see how that fares. Among the 41 people who did say that they had some sort of UX leadership title, there was a real lack of diversity, like a real lack of diversity. So 5 self-identified as visible minorities, and 13 of them self-identified as women. Again, so nearly 70% were men and 88% were white. So again, we're not sure if this reflects the overall trend in industry across Canada, or if it's just a reflection of the people who chose to respond to the survey, but if it is a reflection of industry, then we have a lot of work to do. And in terms of diversity in our executive positions for UX. So, are you trying to figure out where to go when you graduate? It's a good question. Where are the UXers working in Canada? Close to half of our respondents work in large corporations with over 500 employees. And then the other half are spread out among all sorts of smaller organizations that go up to 500. Now, given that the majority of our respondents were in Ottawa, Toronto, Montreal, that might make sense. There's larger companies there. The government is also there, so we didn't ask the government question in this breakdown, we didn't ask for the government perspective in this question, so we don't know if this is skewed because so many of us work for the government. But what we are seeing across Canada is, UX teams are becoming a lot more embedded in places where you might not expect them, right? Like Desjardins Insurance or TELUS Health and other areas where historically they've been these really large companies that have nothing to do with UX, and now they have service design and user experience. So that could be affecting that as well. So it'll be interesting to see how that trends, as well as we expand across different cities. And so once we have a bigger user base and we're getting more cities responding, then we'll see if this trend continues. And I think it'll be interesting if we move away from Ottawa, whether or not that 500 plus is still so big. Now, you can gauge how an organization thinks about UX by its ratio of UX designers to developers. A 2017 article by TechCrunch explored how some of the more popular tech startups are working to bring their ratios down to more closely embed UX in with development. Atlassian went from a 1 to 25 ratio down to 1 to 9. IBM went from 1 to 72 down to 1 to 8. Yeah, which is a lot better. So the lower the ratio, the more involved UX can really be with the development, and going more from an external resource that gets consulted on projects to becoming more of an active part of the team. So most of our survey respondents identified that they work in these large organizations, so it's not a really big surprise that a quarter of them have ratios of 1 to 16. So it's not 1 to 72, but it's still not that low. Half came down with much smaller ratios, either 1 to 3 or 1 to 4 to 8, so under 8 ideally for half of the folks, which is a lot better. So given that the ratios are so high, just how mature are these companies with respect to UX? To measure this, we used a modified version of the UX maturity scales that are common in industry. If you Google UX maturity scales, you're going to find a lot of them. I've been researching them for another presentation I'm giving next week, and they're maddening. But our scale has 5 levels, so it goes from oblivious, I'm sure you've worked there, to interested, to invested, to committed, and finally to embedded, where I want to work. One day I'll work there. Based on the employee ratios, it's not surprising that from a maturity perspective, the most common response was level 2, which is interested. We really like UX. Yay, UX. Not quite doing it, but we're interested. Just a quarter said they worked in either level 4 or level 5, right? So where it's committed or embedded. And only, thankfully, 10% said that they worked in organizations where folks were oblivious to UX. So it can be incredibly demoralizing as a UX professional to work in an organization that doesn't pay any attention to UX. And so I really hope that they find their way soon before they break those poor little UXers' spirits. Looking at the average, so if we look at the scale from 1 to 5, the average is sitting at 2.89, so above interested and just below invested. So it's an indicator that we plan to closely monitor to see if as UX evolves and as we get more people responding, if that number goes up or down. I really hope it goes up. I really hope it goes up. So our respondents mostly have a UX designer title, up to them. Half of them work in large organizations, with the other in differently sized smaller organizations. They generally have low to average UX to developer ratios. And the overall maturity is somewhere between 2 and 3. All right, so how do they work? How do Canadian UXers work? Before you head out, what tools should you know? So this one's really funny for me because I work in a really old school government department, so I use PowerPoint and Excel and Word and, much to Cornelius's chagrin, Paint. True story. I've been really lucky a couple of times, been able to get a balsamic license. Oh my God. But usually if I'm going to do anything, I'm bringing in my Chromebook, which is the network guys. But if you're looking for a job, what is it that you should know if you're working in a more modern government department or actual private sector? So first we looked at tools that are popular for interaction design and prototyping. And for this one, Adobe was off the charts, right? So 63% said that they were using the Adobe Creative Suite. It's a good one to know. And given that more than half of our respondents have less than 5 years experience, the fact that we're seeing Sketch and InVision follow closely behind wasn't that big of a surprise. Other tools with a solid foothold include HTML and CSS, Azure RP, and Balsamic. And I was really happy to see HTML and CSS because that's how I do most of my prototyping, and I'd like to feel them still a little bit relevant, but you know. In terms of research tools, this one is really skewed towards the top 2. So the top 2 are Optimal and user testing. So those are really the top 2 research tools that were being used, and then you were rounding out with Hotjar and Moray, which I literally had never heard of before this study, so I don't know what that says about me, but I probably shouldn't admit that out loud. And then we kind of fell off with a whole bunch of other ones. So, but really, Optimal and user testing are the absolute top ones. Collaboration tools. An overwhelming winner. Can you guess what it is? Can you read the slide? Slack. Everybody writes Slack. So this was a write-in question. We didn't actually give people options. We actually provided write-in, and everybody was like, I use Slack, I use Slack, I use Slack, I use Slack. So yeah, that's the number one thing. So if you don't use Slack and you haven't figured out how to use it yet, learn Slack, because you're probably going to use it when you get into the workplace. This was followed by Google Suite and InVision, which also got double digits, but a lot lower. And then Jira, Trello, Confluence, Real-Time Board, Dropbox, Basecamp, Hangouts. We're going to include the rest of those next year as actual options to see how they fare, except for Hangouts, which is being canceled later this year. Yeah, sorry. True story. Gonna have to find something else. So basically, based on this, Canadian UX professionals who answered our survey designed primarily in Adobe, test with Optimal and user testing, and collaborate in Slack. So at least having these in your toolkit when you hit the job market should set you up for success. All right, and now the money shot, literally. So let's talk about salaries. We did give a sneak peek at CanUX 2018, and as we mentioned, finding reliable salary data for Canadian UXers is really hard. And the numbers really vary significantly from source to source, so it was really, really hard to establish a baseline. And getting this info, this was really one of the main driving forces for this whole survey, right? We were really, really interested in this information. Now, one of the areas that we didn't identify in the survey was the difference between full-time employees and consultants, so people who are paid an actual salary versus people who have an hourly or a daily rate. We are going to break that down for the next one so that we can get a little bit more of a sense of that data. So we don't know how and if that skews any of the findings that we have on some of these charts. All right, what is the average salary? The average salary is $82,000. What does that even mean? So if we compare that to the US, and we use the exchange rate that we had on November 1st, we're 30% below the US. So if we use the exchange rate this week, we're 35%, $40,000 less than the US. Yeah, there's a little bit. Cost of living though, right, when you take that into account. So before you head to the US, let's wait on the rest of these numbers. But essentially, yeah, it's a pretty big discrepancy compared to when you actually do the conversion. So that was quite surprising. We weren't expecting that. We were going to be sitting $40,000 below our counterpoints in the States, especially when you consider there's probably a decent number of government employees who are responding to this, and those salaries are on the lower, for less than 5 years experience, they tend to be higher than what's going on in the private sector. So it was a really interesting number actually to come out with. As I mentioned earlier, overall we had more female respondents than male respondents, and generally the salaries of women and non-binary people were reported as being lower than those of men. Women and non-binary sit below the average, making about $4,000 below the average, whereas men make about $4,000 above the average. So women are making 8K or 10% less than men. On the bright side, this is lower than the national average pay gap across Canada. So the pay gap across Canada is actually 13%. So it looks like, based on our respondents, that our pay gap is lower than the average, not by much. But when you work it out to free days of labor, ladies, listen up. So if you calculate this number into working days, it's 36.5 days. That means as of November 24th, every year you are working for free. Better use up those vacation days. With a 13% pay gap, it's after November 15th. So that's what that means in real time and real dollars. That's what the pay gap represents. And it's pretty mind-blowing. We can definitely do better. If we look at the intersection of salary, experience, and gender, first we'll look at salary by experience alone. So UXers crest really nicely till 10 to 15 years, and then we dip. We don't know why we dip. Do we have kids? Do we have a midlife crisis? Are we buying Harleys and hitting the road? We don't know. But there's some crazy little dip that happens in the 10 to 15 year range, and then it takes off again. So interesting. Going to be looking into that one. In terms of gender, generally speaking, women and non-binary folks make less than men at the lowest and highest levels of experience, but between 3 to 8, it kind of levels out. And in fact, between 5 and 8, we actually overtake the men. So again, not sure if that's just a function of our survey, but it will be interesting to see if that's an actual trend that we see for some reason happening in that time frame. As we resume again, after that little 10 to 15-year gap, then the wage gap reappears and everything's back to normal, if you will. This slide shows the same breakdown of salary and experience, but intersecting with ethnicity instead of gender. So on the lower side, up to 5 years of experience, there's disparity between visible minorities and white people. Then after 5 years, visible minority respondents reported making as much or more than white respondents. So the wage gap among our respondents lasted up to 5 years and then disappeared. Now, the number of visible minority respondents was lower, so that could be, again, that could be a factor, and so it'll be interesting to see how this trends over time. But apparently, it doesn't matter what your cultural heritage or your gender, 10 to 15 years, something wacky's going on. I do not know why there's that weird dip, so we are super fascinated by that. Next, we explored the differences in salary by company type and also by gender. So we surveyed the different types of companies that people were working for: self-employed, NGO nonprofit, startups and small companies, agencies and consultancies, in-house or medium to large companies, public sector government, and academia. And generally the pay scales were really close to the average. And once again, across the board, women and non-binary people were making somewhat less than their male counterparts. But I'm going to just point out this one over here. If you're a dude in nonprofit, you're making like 40% less. You might want to check your salary offer if that's where you're planning on going. We have no idea what's going on there. Could be low numbers, but yeah, we thought that one was a very odd number. So 40% less than your female and non-binary counterparts. So it's a good place to go if you're a lady or non-binary. This slide shows the difference in salary by company type and intersecting with ethnicity. So I'll highlight, we only had a single non-white respondent in the academia category over here on the end, so those results are inconclusive. But there was a lot more parity when we looked at diversity and experience level. When the wage gap becomes far more pronounced when we look at salary averages in specific types of organizations. So although some of the averages are close, there's pretty significant disparity between whites and everybody else in all the organization types. So while there might be diversity and representation, we have not achieved parity in compensation at all. And so we can definitely do better. So this is the chart that completely shocked us when we were compiling this report. Here we can see that visible minority women make less on average than white women, and visible minority men make less on average than white men, and the disparity is pretty significant regardless of gender. But when we compare the salaries of women of minority and white men, there's a 21% difference. It's a huge difference. That's $20,000. Right? $19,000. And that means that as an industry, we need to do better. And that's what makes a survey like this one so important. We have a baseline, right? Now we can see what the average salary is across the UX industry. We can see the wage gaps and we can watch for them. We can use this information to negotiate our next salaries. We can evaluate our offers against this kind of data, right? So this becomes really useful information to refer to when you're looking at getting your salary offers for your next jobs. Rather than guessing what your worth is, right? Lowballing yourself, we've got some good hard data now. It's not fully representative, but it's something that we can work from. And for those of us who are in charge of hiring, I think it's really important that we need to take a look at our own organizations to see how we're doing and to see how we can increase parity between the genders and with visible minorities, because it's clear from our survey that we're not doing enough. And each of us needs to pay close attention and act when we see disparities so that we can do better. Now, there are other State of UX articles you can find out there. They're really interesting. There's other surveys that have kicked off that happened before ours and some that have kicked off because of ours, which is really neat. So Sweden and the US and a whole bunch of other areas that have these State of UX surveys. But one of the things that we noticed is there's this weird trend where people inside and outside the global UX community are of the opinion that our profession is dead or dying, past its heyday. And we disagree. Some of these headlines are definitely clickbait. But the number of open vacancies for UX positions in Canada and abroad and the salaries that we're commanding as UX professionals suggest quite the opposite, right? So the UX community of practice is growing, it's healthy, and it's evolving. Our respondents overwhelmingly support this assessment, as 65% of them said that their organizations were planning on hiring more UXers in the coming year. And I think it's a great time to be a UX professional. Ottawa has a vibrant UX community with events like CanUX, but also community of practice like IXDA and CAPCI and the Government of Canada's own UX network. We're this hotbed of UX. We have companies, big and small, that are growing their UX teams. And we've got some of the best UX consultancies in the country located, in our area. I think it's very much not dead. And I think that we all here are proof of that. Thank you. If you wanted to download the study, that's a very tiny URL, which is much shorter than the one that's on Medium. And then if you wanted to reach out to myself or Cornelius, you can find us on Twitter. That's usually where we live. Thanks.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
When you factored the salary between the United States and Canada, did you look also at the structure of benefits? Because benefits can add like about 20–30% of the value of your salary.
No, we went straight dollars. So that is an assessment that we haven't calculated in. And I think it would be a really tricky one to include in our survey because there are so many government respondents. I think it would really be hard to do that breakdown. So generally, we're just looking dollars.
I have a question. How often are you, sort of, when is going to be the next iteration?
The plan is to do it once a year. Yeah, so we will most likely launch it this summer. This is our 10th year at CanUX, so we've already been working since January, and we don't have the survey ready yet, but I believe that we'll probably be able to launch it for the summer. Yeah, we can definitely let you guys know.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
I just have 2 questions. Was it also done in French or was it English only?
English only right now.
And did you consider having a category for people with disabilities?
Actually, that is a great question. We didn't do a full breakdown. We were just doing visible minorities. But that is something that we want to look at in terms of how much detail do we put in terms of the breakdowns. So it might happen eventually. I don't know that it would happen this year because there's just so many options to consider, and we haven't figured out how much more granular we want to go. That's a great question. Thank you. Cool.
Yes, students have questions about sort of what this could mean for you, or are you shocked or hopeful by something that you heard today?
Too many numbers. Everyone needs more coffee, I feel you.